Chapter 2, Love Against the World. Part 1a. 1. The memory she could not forget. The grand gates of Ashford Manor slowly opened as the carriage rolled into the courtyard. Servants hurried to welcome their young lady home, while lanterns illuminated the elegant gardens that surrounded the mansion. Everything appeared exactly as it had every other evening. Perfectly arranged, perfectly quiet, perfectly orderly. Yet to Isabella, nothing felt the same anymore. Only a few hours earlier, she had stood beneath the lanterns of Eastgate, saying goodbye to a young craftsman named Ethan. His warm smile, gentle voice, and unwavering courage remained vivid in her mind, refusing to fade no matter how hard she tried to focus on anything else. She stepped down from the carriage, smoothing the folds of her dress before entering the manor. A servant bowed respectfully. "Servant, welcome home, Lady Isabella." "Isabella, thank you." Her voice was polite, but distant. She climbed the marble staircase to her bedroom, closed the doors softly behind her, and leaned against it with a long sigh. For the first time in years, the room felt unfamiliar. The embroidered curtains, the crystal chandelier, the shelves filled with expensive books. Everything that had once brought her comfort now seemed strangely empty. Her thoughts drifted back to Black Hollow. She remembered the children laughing over Ethan's handmade wooden birds. She remembered the old baker who had insisted Ethan take warm bread home. She remembered the kindness shared by people who owned so little. And above all, she remembered Ethan standing between her and danger without asking for anything in return. Isabella slowly walked toward her vanity. Resting beside the mirror was the small velvet box where she usually kept her jewelry. She opened it. The space where her silver rose brooch had once rested was empty. A gentle smile touched her lips. She had given that brooch to Ethan without hesitation. It had belonged to her late grandmother, a woman known throughout the kingdom for her compassion. For years, Isabella had treasured it as a reminder that true nobility came not from wealth, but from kindness. Now, that reminder was with Ethan. Oddly enough, she did not regret giving it away, not even for a moment. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Emily, may I come in?" "Isabella, of course." Emily entered carrying a small tray with a teapot and two delicate porcelain cups. She placed the tray on the table before studying Isabella's face. "Emily, you've been unusually quiet since we left the festival." Isabella offered a faint smile. "Isabella, have I?" "Emily, you disappeared for nearly an hour." Emily folded her arms, trying to sound serious, though concern softened her expression. "Emily." Everyone was worried. Isabella looked away toward the window. She had promised herself not to lie to Emily, yet she wasn't ready to tell the whole truth. "Isabella, I wandered farther than I intended." "Emily, did something happen?" For a brief moment, Isabella considered saying no. Instead, she whispered, "Isabella, someone helped me." Emily blinked. "Emily helped you?" Isabella nodded. "Isabella, I got lost. There were some dangerous men. If he hadn't appeared." She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Emily's expression changed immediately. She crossed the room and gently took Isabella's hands. "Emily, were you hurt?" "Isabella, no." She smiled reassuringly. "He made sure I wasn't." Emily let out the breath she had been holding. "Emily, thank goodness." A moment of silence passed. Then Emily tilted her head with a curious smile. "Emily, who was he?" The question caught Isabella by surprise. Without realizing it, she smiled. Not the polite smile expected of a noble lady. A genuine one. "Isabella, his name is Ethan." She spoke the name quietly, almost as if afraid the room itself might remember it. Emily noticed. She had known Isabella since childhood. She had seen her laugh, cry, become frustrated, and celebrate. But she had never seen her smile like this. "Emily, he must be someone very special." Isabella lowered her eyes. "Isabella, he's different." Emily sat beside her. "Emily, different how?" Isabella searched for the right words. "Isabella, he never asked who I was. He didn't care about my family. He didn't expect anything in return. He simply helped me because I needed help." She paused before adding softly, "Isabella, I've never met anyone like him." Emily listened without interrupting. For the first time, she realized Isabella wasn't simply talking about the young man who had rescued her. She was talking about someone who had quietly changed the way she saw the world. Outside the window, the bells of the city cathedral rang 9 times. Night had settled over Eldoria. The streets grew quiet. Most of the kingdom was preparing for sleep. But sleep felt impossibly far away for Isabella. After Emily wished her good night and left the room, Isabella changed into a simple white night dress. She extinguished all but one candle. The soft golden light danced across the walls. She lay down beneath the embroidered blankets and closed her eyes. Almost immediately, she saw Ethan again. His calm gray eyes. His quiet smile. The way he had stood in front of her without a second thought. His words echoed gently in her memory. "As long as I'm standing, no one will touch you." Isabella opened her eyes. She stared at the ceiling. Then, almost without thinking, she whispered into the silence. "Isabella, I hope you're safe, Ethan." Far away, beyond the river, in the humble streets of Black Hollow, another young heart was also finding it impossible to forget. The morning sun poured gently through the tall windows of Ashford Manor, bathing Isabella's bedroom in warm golden light. Normally, she would already be dressed and preparing for her lessons. Today, however, she remained seated beside the window, absent-mindedly watching the gardens below. A pair of bluebirds landed on a marble fountain before flying freely into the open sky. She followed them until they disappeared beyond the trees. A quiet smile touched her lips. Narrator. She wondered if Ethan had already begun his day. Was he repairing another roof? Carving another wooden toy for the neighborhood children? Or perhaps sharing breakfast with the old baker who treated him like family? She knew almost nothing about his life. Yet somehow, she wanted to know everything. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Maid. Lady Isabella, breakfast is ready." "Isabella, I'll be down in a moment." The maid bowed and quietly left. Isabella remained where she was. For the first time in years, she had no interest in the carefully planned schedule waiting downstairs. The dining hall was as elegant as ever. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. Fresh flowers decorated the long oak table. Silver dishes reflected the morning light. Lord Ashford sat at the head of the table, reading several letters while sipping his tea. Lady Eleanor smiled as Isabella entered. "Lady Eleanor. Good morning, dear." "Isabella. Good morning, mother." "Lord Ashford. You seem tired. I trust yesterday's festival wasn't too exhausting." Isabella hesitated only for a moment. "Isabella. It was eventful." Her father smiled without looking up from his letters. "Lord Ashford. The city can be overwhelming. That's why noble families travel with guards." His words carried no suspicion, only a father's practical advice. Yet Isabella felt a small wave of guilt. She quietly lowered her eyes. Throughout breakfast, the conversation revolved around estate matters, upcoming banquets, and preparations for the royal summer ball. Usually, Isabella listened politely. Today, she barely heard a word. Instead, her thoughts drifted back to Black Hollow. She remembered the lively streets, the smell of fresh bread, the children laughing around Ethan. Compared with those memories, the luxurious dining hall suddenly felt strangely quiet. Later that morning, Professor Collins arrived for her history lesson. Ancient maps covered the study walls. Leather-bound books filled every shelf. The elderly professor adjusted his glasses before beginning. "Professor Collins. Lady Isabella, can you tell me why the northern provinces prospered after the great harvest?" Silence. The professor looked up. Isabella was staring through the open window, far beyond the gardens, far beyond the lesson. "Professor Collins. Lady Isabella?" She blinked. "Isabella, I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question?" The professor smiled kindly. "In all my years teaching you, I've never had to repeat a question." Emily, who was quietly reading nearby, couldn't help smiling. She had noticed the same thing since yesterday. Something had changed. When the lesson finally ended, Emily found Isabella walking alone in the rose garden. Bright red roses bloomed along the stone paths. Usually, Isabella loved spending time there. Today, she simply wandered without direction. Emily caught up beside her. "Emily, you've been thinking about him all day." Isabella stopped walking. She looked down at a blooming white rose. For a moment, she considered denying it. Instead, she smiled. "Isabella, is it really that obvious?" Emily laughed softly, only to someone who has known you since childhood. They continued walking together. The garden was peaceful. The gentle sound of birds filled the morning air. "Emily, so, what is he really like?" Isabella's eyes brightened immediately. She didn't even realize it. "Isabella, he's kind. He listens more than he speaks. He helps people without expecting anything. He treats everyone with respect. Emily listened carefully. Then she asked the one question Isabella hadn't expected. Emily, is he handsome? Isabella laughed. A genuine laugh. Perhaps the first in several days. Isabella, I didn't notice at first. Emily raised an eyebrow. But later, Isabella looked toward the sky, remembering. Isabella, he has the kindest eyes I've ever seen. Emily smiled knowingly. I think. You miss him? The words hung gently between them. Isabella didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached out and lightly touched the petals of a white rose. Finally, she whispered, Isabella, I don't understand. We only met once. So why does it feel? She searched for the right words. As though I've known him much longer? Emily rested a comforting hand on her shoulder. Emily, sometimes, the people who change our lives don't need much time to do it. Those words stayed with Isabella long after their conversation ended. That evening, Isabella returned to her bedroom carrying the novel she had intended to read. She opened the first page, then the second, then the third. When she reached the fourth page, she realized she hadn't understood a single sentence. Her thoughts had wandered once again. She gently closed the book. On the writing desk beside the window lay a blank sheet of paper. Without thinking, she picked up a pen. Slowly, she wrote a single name. Ethan. She stared at the word for a long time. Then, with a small, embarrassed smile, she folded the paper and tucked it inside her favorite book. Not because she wanted anyone else to see it, but because she wasn't ready to let go of the memory. Outside, the evening breeze rustled through the trees. Far beyond Ashford Manor, beyond the river, beyond the quiet streets of the city, someone else was looking at the same moon and wondering if a certain noble girl had made it home safely. The days passed quietly at Ashford Manor. To everyone around her, Lady Isabella seemed to have returned to her usual routine. She attended her lessons, joined her parents for meals, and greeted visiting nobles with the grace expected of an Ashford. But behind her gentle smile, something had changed. Every evening, she found herself standing by the same window, looking toward the distant part of the city where Black Hollow lay hidden beyond the river. She wondered if Ethan was well. She wondered if he had repaired his injured shoulder. Most of all, she wondered whether he had forgotten about her. Underscore, underscore. One afternoon, Emily entered Isabella's room without knocking, carrying a basket filled with ribbons for the upcoming royal summer ball. She immediately noticed Isabella sitting at her writing desk. Instead of reading, Isabella was quietly staring at a simple map of Eldoria. Her finger rested on one particular place. Black Hollow. Emily smiled knowingly. Emily, you're thinking about going back. Startled, Isabella quickly folded the map. Isabella, was it really that obvious? Emily placed the basket on the bed. Emily, you've looked toward that part of the city every day since the festival. She sat beside her cousin. Emily, is this about Ethan? For a moment, Isabella remained silent. Then she nodded. Isabella, I never thanked him properly. Emily raised an eyebrow. Emily, you thanked him several times. Isabella, not for saving my life. Emily looked at her curiously. Emily, then for what? Isabella took a deep breath. Isabella, for changing how I see the world. The room fell quiet. Emily could hear the sincerity in every word. This was no childish fascination. Something much deeper had begun to grow. Underscore. Emily walked to the window and looked out over the gardens. Emily, if you go back, she paused, you'll be breaking your parents' trust. Isabella slowly joined her. Isabella, I know. Emily, if Lord Ashford discovers you've been visiting Black Hollow alone. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Both young women knew exactly how serious the consequences would be. Isabella lowered her eyes. Isabella, I've thought about that every day. Emily turned toward her. Emily, then why risk it? For a long moment, Isabella searched for the right answer. Finally, she smiled, a quiet smile filled with honesty. Isabella, because some people enter your life for only a few moments and somehow leave behind questions that won't let your heart rest. Emily studied her cousin carefully. She had never seen Isabella speak this way before. Not about books. Not about music. Certainly not about another person. The bells of the city cathedral echoed faintly across the afternoon sky. Emily sighed. Emily, when do you plan to go? Isabella looked surprised. Isabella, you are not going to stop me? Emily laughed softly. Emily, have I ever succeeded? Both of them smiled. Then Emily's expression became serious again. Emily, if you truly believe you need to see him again, then at least promise me you'll be careful. Isabella gently squeezed her cousin's hand. Isabella, I promise. The following morning, Ashford Manor became unusually busy. Servants hurried through the halls preparing for Lady Eleanor's charity luncheon. Guests from several noble families were expected before noon. The entire household focused on the event. Exactly as Isabella had hoped. She dressed more simply than usual. Instead of wearing an elegant silk gown, she chose a modest blue dress and a plain white cloak. She braided her hair and tucked it beneath a light bonnet. Looking into the mirror, she barely recognized herself. For the first time, she looked less like Lady Isabella Ashford and more like an ordinary young woman. Emily quietly entered the room. She looked Isabella up and down before smiling. Emily, much better. Isabella, do I still look like a noble lady? Emily shook her head. Emily, only if someone looks very closely. She reached into a drawer and handed Isabella a small leather pouch. Emily, take this. Inside were a few silver coins. Isabella immediately shook her head. Isabella, I can't. Emily, you might need them. Isabella, I shouldn't accept your money. Emily folded Isabella's fingers gently around the pouch. Emily, then consider it a loan. A warm silence settled between them. Finally, Emily stepped back. Emily, come home before sunset. Isabella nodded. Isabella, I will. She waited patiently until the first guests arrived at the manor. The sound of greetings, laughter, and carriage wheels filled the front courtyard. Servants hurried in every direction. No one noticed one young woman quietly leaving through the garden gate. Isabella glanced back only once. The grand manor stood proudly beneath the clear blue sky. It had always been her home. Yet for the first time, it no longer felt like the only place where her heart belonged. She pulled her cloak a little tighter and began walking toward the city. Each step carried her farther from the life she had always known, and closer to the promise she had made only to herself, to see Ethan once again. As the towers of Ashford Manor disappeared behind the trees, Isabella smiled. She didn't know what would happen when they met again. She didn't even know if Ethan would be happy to see her. But one thing was certain. This time, she wasn't getting lost. She was following her heart. The streets of Eldoria were already alive when Isabella reached the city. Merchants greeted early customers with cheerful voices. Bakers placed warm loaves of bread in their shop windows, and children hurried through the market carrying baskets almost as large as themselves. For the first time, Isabella wasn't wandering without purpose. She knew exactly where she wanted to go. Black Hollow. As she crossed the old stone bridge leading to the poorer district, she took a deep breath. The neighborhood looked just as she remembered. The houses were small and worn, but flowers bloomed in wooden boxes beneath many windows. Women swept the streets while neighbors chatted over morning tea. It wasn't a place of fear. It was simply home to people who worked hard every day. Isabella smiled. Perhaps she had judged this place far too quickly. A familiar scent drifted through the air. Fresh bread. She turned her head and immediately recognized the tiny bakery where Ethan had spoken with the elderly baker. The old man stood outside, arranging warm loaves on a wooden shelf. When he noticed the young woman in the blue dress, he smiled kindly. Mr. Baker, good morning, miss. Isabella, good morning. She hesitated for a moment before asking. Isabella, may I ask you something? Mr. Baker, of course. Isabella, do you happen to know a young man named Ethan? The old baker's face brightened immediately. Mr. Baker, Ethan? He laughed warmly. I'd be surprised if anyone around here didn't know him. Isabella felt a quiet sense of relief. At least she had come to the right place. Mr. Baker, are you a friend of his? Isabella smiled politely. Isabella, he helped me recently. The baker nodded as though that explained everything. Mr. Baker, that sounds like Ethan. If someone needs help, he's usually the first one to step forward. He pointed farther down the street. There's a carpenter's workshop near the old clock tower. He spends most mornings there. Isabella thanked him before continuing on her way. As she walked, she couldn't stop smiling. Every step brought her closer to the person she had been hoping to see again. The rhythmic sound of hammering echoed through the narrow street. Tap, tap, tap. Isabella slowed her pace. Ahead stood a modest wooden workshop with wide-open doors. Inside, sunlight streamed across piles of neatly cut timber. Several craftsmen worked quietly, shaping chairs, tables, and cabinets. Near the back of the workshop, a familiar young man carefully sanded the edge of a wooden toy horse. His sleeves were rolled above his elbows, and tiny curls of fresh wood rested on his workbench. He looked completely focused, completely at peace. For a moment, Isabella simply stood there, watching. She almost turned around. What if he didn't remember her? What if she had imagined the connection they shared? Before she could decide, Ethan looked up. Their eyes met. He froze. The piece of sandpaper slipped from his hand. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan smiled. Not out of politeness, not out of surprise, but with unmistakable happiness. He quickly set the toy horse aside and walked toward the entrance. Ethan, Isabella. Hearing her name on his lips made her heart beat just a little faster. She smiled. Isabella. Hello, Ethan. For a brief moment, they simply looked at one another. It had only been a few days, yet somehow, it felt much longer. Ethan broke the silence first. Ethan, I wasn't sure I'd ever see you again. Isabella lowered her eyes with a shy smile. Isabella, neither was I. He laughed softly. So, you really found your way back. She nodded. This time I didn't get lost. Both of them laughed. The nervousness that had filled the first few moments disappeared almost instantly. An older craftsman glanced over from another workbench. He smiled knowingly before returning to his work, giving the two young people a little privacy. Ethan brushed the sawdust from his hands. Ethan, I wish I'd known you were coming. Isabella, why? Ethan, I would have cleaned the workshop. She looked around. The room smelled of fresh pine and cedar. Sunlight filtered through the windows. Wooden toys lined the shelves beside carefully crafted furniture. To Isabella, it felt warm, honest, comfortable. She smiled. Isabella, I like it exactly as it is. For a moment, Ethan seemed unsure what to say. Most visitors from the richer districts would have called the workshop old or shabby. She had called it beautiful without using the word. His eyes suddenly fell upon her cloak. Ethan, you came here alone? Isabella, yes. He frowned gently. That's dangerous. She smiled playfully. I had an excellent guide last time. Ethan couldn't help laughing. I'm not always around to rescue people. I know. She looked at him with quiet sincerity. That's why I made sure not to get lost. Their eyes met again. This time, neither looked away immediately. There was no awkwardness, only a growing sense of comfort, as though speaking with one another had become unexpectedly easy. Ethan remembered something. He reached carefully into a small wooden drawer beside his workbench. From inside, he removed a neatly wrapped cloth. When he unfolded it, the silver rose brooch caught the morning light. Ethan, I've been meaning to return this. Isabella looked at the brooch before gently shaking her head. Isabella, it belongs to you now. Ethan, it's far too valuable. I can't accept something like this. She stepped a little closer. It wasn't payment. It was a gift. He looked uncertain. I've never received a gift like this. She smiled. Then keep it, so you'll remember that your kindness changed someone's life. Ethan lowered his gaze to the silver rose resting in his palm. After a long pause, he carefully tucked it back into the cloth. Ethan, I'll treasure it. The sincerity in his voice made Isabella's smile grow a little brighter. Outside, the bells of the old clock tower rang softly across Black Hollow. The morning sun climbed higher into the sky. Neither Ethan nor Isabella realized how quickly time had passed. They only knew one thing. Meeting again felt remarkably natural, as if fate had quietly kept the promise that both of them had been too shy to speak aloud. Ethan, would you like to see more of Black Hollow? Isabella's eyes lit up immediately. Isabella, I'd love to. Ethan picked up his coat from a wooden peg beside the door. Then, together, they stepped out of the workshop. Side by side, neither noticed the curious glance of a passing carriage driver from the noble district, nor did they realize that somewhere beyond the busy streets, someone had already begun to wonder why Lady Isabella Ashford had disappeared once again. Autumn arrived quietly in Eldoria. The leaves along the river slowly turned shades of gold and amber, while a cool breeze wandered through the streets of Black Hollow. Weeks had passed since Isabella first returned. What began as a single visit had slowly become a quiet routine. Whenever her family was occupied with estate meetings, charity events, or royal ceremonies, Isabella would find a reason to leave Ashford Manor. Sometimes she brought fresh bread from the city. Sometimes she carried books for the neighborhood children. Other times, she came with nothing at all, simply because she wanted to see Ethan. Every visit revealed another side of Black Hollow. She learned the names of the children who ran through the streets every afternoon. She listened to old Mrs. Martha tell stories about the district's early days. She even learned how to polish wooden toys in Ethan's workshop, though her first attempts left more sawdust on her dress than on the workbench. The people welcomed her warmly. To them, she wasn't a noblewoman. She was simply Isabella, and that made her happier than she had ever expected. One quiet afternoon, Ethan and Isabella sat on the stone steps outside the workshop, watching children play with the wooden toys Ethan had made. A little boy proudly held up a wooden horse. "Little boy, look, mine runs faster than yours." The other children burst into laughter. Isabella smiled. "Isabella, they adore you." Ethan watched the children with gentle eyes. "Ethan, they're the reason I keep making toys. Not everyone here can afford expensive gifts, but every child deserves something to smile about." Isabella looked at him in silence. There he was again, thinking about everyone except himself. Later that afternoon, rain began to fall. The children hurried home, laughing as they ran through the puddles. Ethan and Isabella remained beneath the workshop roof. For a while, neither of them spoke. The sound of rain was enough. Finally, Isabella broke the silence. "Isabella, are you ever unhappy?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Sometimes, but unhappiness doesn't last forever." She looked at him. "How can you be so certain?" He watched the rain. "Because tomorrow always comes, and tomorrow gives us another chance." His answer stayed with Isabella long after the rain had ended. That evening, Ethan walked Isabella to the old stone bridge. The city lights shimmered across the river. They stopped where they always said goodbye. Neither seemed eager to leave. "Isabella, thank you." Ethan laughed softly. "You thank me every time we meet." She smiled. "Because every time I leave, I've learned something new." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he quietly asked, "Ethan, why do you keep coming back?" The question surprised even him. Isabella lowered her eyes. She hadn't prepared an answer. After a moment, she whispered, "Isabella, because this place feels peaceful." She looked up again. "And because my friends are here." Her words made Ethan smile. But somewhere deep inside his heart, another answer quietly formed. "Because you're here." He never spoke those words aloud. That night, Ethan returned to his small room above the workshop. The room contained little more than a narrow bed, a wooden desk, and a single bookshelf. He carefully removed the silver rose brooch from a small box. The candlelight reflected softly against its delicate petals. He turned it over in his hands, then sighed. "Ethan, what are you doing?" The question wasn't directed at anyone else. It was for himself. He already knew the answer. He had begun looking forward to every visit. He noticed when Isabella laughed. He remembered the stories she told. He missed her after she left. Somewhere along the way, friendship had quietly become something deeper, something far more dangerous. He closed his hand around the brooch. "Ethan, she's an Ashford, the daughter of one of the most respected noble families in the kingdom. And I'm—" He looked around his simple room. "Just a carpenter." The difference between their worlds suddenly felt enormous. Not measured in streets or in money, but in expectations, duty, family, status. He knew people like Isabella were expected to marry noblemen, future lords, military officers, princes, perhaps. Never someone like him. A painful smile crossed his face. "Ethan, some dreams are beautiful because they can never come true." He carefully placed the brooch back into its box, not to forget Isabella, but to remind himself that some feelings were meant to remain unspoken. Outside his window, the moon hung quietly above Black Hollow. Somewhere beyond the river, in a room filled with silk curtains and candlelight, Isabella was looking at the very same moon. Neither of them realized that their hearts had already begun walking the same path. One accepted those feelings with quiet hope. The other chose to hide them behind a gentle smile. Yet fate has a curious way of testing promises that no one dares to speak aloud. When roses bloom in the slums, Chapter 2, Love Against the World. Part 3b, The Heart That Finally Understood. The days that followed slipped by like autumn leaves carried gently on the wind. To everyone else, Lady Isabella Ashford remained the same graceful young noblewoman she had always been. She attended afternoon teas. She practiced the piano. She smiled politely at guests. She listened patiently during long conversations about noble families, future engagements, and grand celebrations. Yet somewhere between those carefully planned days, her heart had quietly wandered elsewhere. One afternoon, Lady Eleanor invited several distinguished families to Ashford Manor for tea. The drawing room sparkled with crystal chandeliers, silver trays, and elegant bouquets of white lilies. Young noblemen greeted Isabella with perfect manners. One praised her musical talent. Another admired her paintings. A third spoke confidently about his future career in the royal court. Isabella answered every conversation with kindness, but her smile never quite reached her eyes. As one gentleman described his family's newest estate, her thoughts drifted away. She remembered Ethan laughing when a little girl had accidentally covered his face with sawdust. She remembered the way he patiently repaired an old woman's broken chair without accepting payment. She remembered how naturally he treated everyone with respect. Without realizing it, she smiled. A genuine smile. Not because of the conversation around her, but because of a memory. Emily noticed immediately. When the guests finally departed, she found Isabella standing alone on the balcony overlooking the gardens. The evening breeze gently stirred the roses climbing the stone walls. Emily stepped beside her. "Emily, you smiled more while daydreaming than while talking to any of those gentlemen." Isabella laughed softly. "Isabella, was it that obvious?" Emily folded her arms. "Emily, only to someone who knows you." She studied Isabella's face for a moment. Then she asked quietly, "Emily, are you thinking about Ethan again?" Isabella didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked toward the western horizon where the sun slowly disappeared behind the hills. Finally, she nodded. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence felt comfortable. Emily had learned that Isabella often found the right words only after allowing herself time to think. At last, Isabella spoke. "Isabella, do you remember what I told you after the spring festival?" Emily smiled. "Emily, you said he'd changed the way you saw the world." Isabella nodded. "I thought it was only gratitude." She looked down at her hands. "I kept telling myself that. But every morning, he's the first person I think about. And every evening, I wonder how his day ended." She laughed quietly at herself. "I even find myself smiling whenever I remember something he said." Emily's smile softened. She had already guessed the answer. She simply wanted Isabella to discover it herself. A flock of birds crossed the evening sky. Isabella watched them disappear into the distance. "Isabella, when I'm with Ethan, I don't feel like Lady Isabella Ashford. I don't worry about making mistakes. I don't have to remember the proper way to sit, speak, or smile." She took a slow breath. "I can simply be myself." Emily gently rested a hand on her shoulder. "Emily, and how does that make you feel?" Isabella's eyes became misty. She whispered almost too quietly to hear. "Isabella, free." The word lingered in the cool evening air. Emily smiled. "Sometimes, the person who gives us the courage to become ourselves becomes the most important person in our lives." That night, Isabella sat beside the window in her bedroom. The moonlight spilled across her writing desk. She opened a small leather journal that she had kept since childhood. Most of its pages contained sketches of flowers, poems copied from old books, and dreams she had never shared with anyone. She dipped her pen into the ink. For several moments, she simply stared at the blank page. Then she began to write. "Today I finally admitted something I have been trying to hide from myself." She paused. A gentle smile appeared on her lips. "I keep looking for reasons to visit Black Hollow. I tell everyone it is because I enjoy helping the children, or because I want to learn about ordinary life. But those are not the real reasons anymore." She stopped writing. Her cheeks grew warm. Slowly, she wrote one final sentence. "The truth is, I only wish to see Ethan." She stared at the words for a long time. Then she carefully closed the journal and held it against her heart. There was no fear in that moment, only honesty. For the first time since they had met beneath the lanterns of Eastgate, Isabella understood what her heart had been trying to tell her. She wasn't merely grateful. She wasn't simply curious. She wasn't visiting Black Hollow because it was different from her own world. She was going back because somewhere among its narrow streets lived a young carpenter whose kindness had quietly become the brightest part of her days. She loved him. The realization was both beautiful and terrifying, because even as happiness filled her heart, another thought followed close behind. Could a daughter of one of the kingdom's most powerful noble families ever have a future with a man from Black Hollow? She did not know the answer. But one thing had become certain. No matter how impossible the road ahead might be, her heart had already chosen, and there was no turning back. Autumn settled gently over Ashford Manor. Golden leaves drifted across the gardens, and cool breezes carried the scent of roses through the open windows. From the outside, life within the Ashford estate appeared as peaceful and orderly as ever. But inside the manor, small changes had begun to draw quiet attention. Lady Eleanor sat in the drawing room reviewing invitations for the upcoming Royal Harvest Ball. Without looking up from the stack of letters, she spoke calmly. "Lady Eleanor, have you noticed anything unusual about Isabella lately?" Mrs. Harper, the family's longtime housekeeper, looked up in surprise. "Mrs. Harper, my lady?" Lady Eleanor folded one invitation and placed it neatly on the table. "Lady Eleanor. She spends less time reading. She often asks to walk in the gardens alone. And twice this week." She returned much later than expected. Mrs. Harper hesitated. She had noticed the same thing. "Mrs. Harper, I assumed Lady Isabella simply wished to enjoy the autumn weather." Lady Eleanor smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but a mother notices when her daughter's smile begins to change." She looked toward the window. "She seems happier, and yet somehow more distant." Meanwhile, upstairs, Isabella carefully folded a simple blue dress and placed it beneath her elegant gowns. She had become practiced at hiding the clothes she wore whenever she visited Black Hollow. A soft knock came at the door. "Emily, may I come in?" "Isabella, of course." Emily entered, but immediately noticed the travel cloak lying across the chair. She closed the door behind her. "Emily, you're going again today." It wasn't a question. Isabella smiled apologetically. "Isabella, only for a little while." Emily sighed. "I've stopped trying to change your mind." She lowered her voice. "But people are beginning to notice." Isabella paused. "What do you mean?" Emily stepped closer. "Emily, yesterday one of the maids asked where you disappear every Thursday afternoon. And this morning, Mrs. Harper asked me whether you seemed unhappy." The smile slowly faded from Isabella's face. For the first time, she realized her secret might not remain hidden forever. Later that afternoon, Isabella quietly left the manor through the garden gate, just as she had done many times before. She never noticed the figure standing behind a row of tall hedges. Mrs. Harper watched silently as the young lady disappeared down the country road. The housekeeper frowned. She had served the Ashford family for more than 30 years. She had helped raise Isabella from infancy. She knew the young lady was kind, honest, responsible, which was exactly why this behavior troubled her. Lady Isabella had never hidden anything before. Mrs. Harper whispered to herself. "Mrs. Harper, forgive me, my lady, but I believe I should know where you're going." She quietly followed at a careful distance. The journey led farther than she expected, beyond the noble district, past the bustling marketplace, across the old stone bridge. Mrs. Harper slowed her steps, her expression filled with confusion. Black Hollow. Why would Lady Isabella come here? She remained hidden among the crowd, careful not to be seen. A few minutes later, Isabella stopped outside a familiar carpenter's workshop. The door opened. A young man stepped outside, brushing sawdust from his hands. The moment he saw Isabella, his face lit up with an unmistakable smile. "Ethan, you made it." Isabella smiled just as brightly. "Isabella, I told you I'd come." Without hesitation, they began walking together through the streets of Black Hollow, laughing, talking, completely at ease in each other's company. Mrs. Harper felt her heart sink. She didn't know the young man, but she understood enough. This was no chance meeting. They had clearly known each other for some time. She watched Ethan gently help an elderly woman carry a basket. She saw neighborhood children run toward him with joyful laughter. Then she looked back at Isabella. The young lady smiled more naturally than Mrs. Harper had seen in months. For a brief moment, the housekeeper almost turned around. She wanted to believe there was nothing wrong with what she had witnessed, but duty weighed heavily upon her heart. She had sworn to protect the Ashford family, even when the truth was painful. That evening, Ashford Manor stood unusually quiet. Lady Eleanor looked up as Mrs. Harper entered the drawing room. One glance at the housekeeper's face was enough. Something had happened. Lady Eleanor, you found her. Mrs. Harper lowered her head respectfully. Mrs. Harper, yes, my lady. Lady Eleanor slowly set down her teacup. Where has Isabella been going? Mrs. Harper hesitated. She chose each word carefully. Mrs. Harper, Lady Isabella has been visiting Black Hollow. Silence filled the room. Lady Eleanor's expression slowly changed. Not to anger, but to disbelief. Lady Eleanor, Black Hollow. Mrs. Harper nodded. And she stopped for a moment before continuing. She was not alone. Lady Eleanor's fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. Lady Eleanor, who was with her? Mrs. Harper took a slow breath. A young carpenter. He appears to know Lady Isabella very well. The room fell completely silent. Outside, the wind rustled through the autumn trees. Neither woman noticed that the library door had been left slightly open. Behind it, Lord Ashford had heard every single word, and the look on his face suggested that the peaceful days of Ashford Manor were about to come to an end. Morning sunlight spread across the gardens of Ashford Manor as Lady Isabella quietly prepared to leave once again. She wore the same simple blue dress she always chose whenever she visited Black Hollow. A plain white cloak covered her shoulders, and her hair was carefully braided beneath a modest bonnet. Looking into the mirror, she smiled to herself. It had become almost a tradition. Every visit to Black Hollow made her feel lighter. Every conversation with Ethan reminded her that kindness could exist without titles or wealth. She picked up a small basket filled with fresh apples and homemade pastries. They weren't expensive gifts. She simply wanted to share them with Ethan and the children she had come to know. Downstairs, the manor buzzed with activity. Servants hurried through the hallways preparing for Lord Ashford's guests. No one seemed to notice Isabella quietly leaving through the garden gate. No one, except Mrs. Harper. The elderly housekeeper stood behind the kitchen window, watching silently. She had served the Ashford family for more than 3 decades. She had seen Isabella grow from a curious little girl into a graceful young woman. She trusted her, but she also knew something was wrong. Lady Isabella had never hidden her whereabouts before. Mrs. Harper whispered softly. Mrs. Harper, please forgive me, my lady. I pray I've misunderstood. With that, she quietly followed. She stayed far enough behind to avoid being seen. Years of managing a large household had taught her patience. She knew how to move without drawing attention. Isabella crossed the busy marketplace. She stopped briefly at a flower stand to buy a small bouquet of wild daisies. Mrs. Harper frowned. Those weren't the flowers noble ladies usually preferred. They were simple, ordinary, just like the flowers that grew freely around Black Hollow. The young housekeeper's suspicion deepened. After nearly half an hour of walking, Isabella crossed the old stone bridge. Mrs. Harper stopped. Her heart skipped a beat. Beyond the bridge lay Black Hollow, the poorest district in Eldoria. Why would Lady Isabella come here? She carefully continued her pursuit, keeping hidden among the morning crowd. The streets of Black Hollow were already alive. Children chased one another between the narrow alleys. Neighbors greeted each other warmly from open windows. A blacksmith laughed as he spoke with a baker carrying fresh bread. Life here was simple, yet it felt strangely joyful. Mrs. Harper had expected disorder. Instead, she found a close-knit community. Still, that wasn't why she had come. Her eyes never left Isabella. Finally, Isabella stopped in front of a modest carpenter's workshop. The wooden sign above the entrance swayed gently in the breeze. From inside came the familiar rhythm of hammer against wood. Tap, tap, tap. A moment later, a young man stepped outside carrying a wooden chair. He looked up. The instant he saw Isabella, his face lit up. A smile appeared so naturally that it could never have been rehearsed. Ethan, Isabella. His voice carried both surprise and happiness. Isabella smiled just as warmly. Isabella. Good morning, Ethan. Without thinking, Ethan placed the chair aside and walked toward her. His eyes immediately noticed the basket in her hands. Ethan, you brought all this? Isabella. The children liked the pastries last time, and I thought you might enjoy some as well. Ethan laughed softly. Ethan, you really remembered. She looked at him with gentle eyes. Isabella, of course I remembered. From where she stood behind a nearby wagon, Mrs. Harper felt her heart grow heavy. This wasn't the awkward conversation of two strangers. They spoke with ease. With familiarity, with affection, a group of children suddenly ran toward the workshop. Little girl, Miss Isabella. The young noblewoman knelt immediately to greet them. She handed each child an apple from the basket. The children surrounded her with joyful laughter. Ethan watched the scene quietly. There was warmth in his eyes. Not admiration, not curiosity, something deeper. Mrs. Harper noticed it immediately. She had watched countless young couples fall in love over the years. She recognized that look. A little boy tugged gently on Ethan's sleeve. Little boy, are you and Miss Isabella coming with us? Ethan smiled. If Miss Isabella doesn't mind. The children cheered. Without hesitation, Isabella nodded. Isabella, I'd love to. The children raced toward the small square nearby. Ethan slowed his pace so Isabella could walk beside him. They talked softly as they followed. Neither realized someone was watching from a distance. Mrs. Harper couldn't hear every word, but she didn't need to. She saw Ethan carrying the heavy basket before Isabella even asked. She saw Isabella laughing freely. A laugh Mrs. Harper hadn't heard inside Ashford Manor for many months. She saw Ethan gently move a loose wooden card out of Isabella's path so she wouldn't trip. Every small gesture spoke louder than words. Mrs. Harper closed her eyes for a brief moment. Her heart ached. She wasn't upset because Ethan was poor. In truth, he seemed respectful, honest, hardworking, everything a good man should be. That was precisely what frightened her. Because the kinder he appeared, the more difficult it would be for Isabella to let him go. As the afternoon sun began to sink lower in the sky, Mrs. Harper quietly turned away. She had seen enough. She walked slowly back toward Ashford Manor. Every step felt heavier than the last. She knew what duty required. She also knew what it would cost. Some secrets were too dangerous to remain hidden, and this one would soon reach Lord Ashford. Far behind her, laughter echoed through the streets of Black Hollow. Isabella and Ethan continued walking side by side, completely unaware that their happiest moments together had just been witnessed by the one person who could change both of their lives forever. A heavy silence settled over the drawing room of Ashford Manor. The fire crackled softly in the marble fireplace, yet the warmth never seemed to reach the room. Mrs. Harper stood quietly before Lord and Lady Ashford, her hands folded respectfully in front of her. She had served the family for more than 30 years. Never once had she brought news that weighed so heavily upon her heart. Lord Ashford slowly set his teacup onto the table. His expression remained calm, but his voice carried unmistakable authority. Lord Ashford, tell me everything. Mrs. Harper lowered her head. Mrs. Harper, yes, my lord. She took a slow breath before continuing. Mrs. Harper, Lady Isabella has visited Black Hollow several times over the past few weeks. Neither parent interrupted. The room became even quieter. Mrs. Harper, each time, she met the same young man. Lady Eleanor exchanged a worried glance with her husband. Lady Eleanor, who is he? Mrs. Harper answered honestly. Mrs. Harper, his name is Ethan. He works as a carpenter near the old clock tower. He lives in Black Hollow. Lord Ashford's eyes narrowed slightly. Lord Ashford, a carpenter? Mrs. Harper nodded. Mrs. Harper, yes, my lord. He is well respected by the people there. The children adore him. He often repairs furniture for elderly neighbors without asking for payment. He appears to be an honest young man. For a brief moment, Lord Ashford remained silent. Then he spoke in a calm voice that somehow felt colder than anger. Lord Ashford, his character is not the issue. The issue is who he is. Lady Eleanor slowly walked toward the window. Beyond the gardens, the last light of the evening faded behind the hills. Her voice was filled with quiet concern. Lady Eleanor, Isabella has always been kind. She has always cared about people. I can understand why she would visit a poorer district. She paused. But, she turned toward Mrs. Harper. Are you certain this young man means more to her than friendship? Mrs. Harper hesitated. She wished she could offer reassurance. Instead, she answered truthfully. Mrs. Harper, I watched them together for nearly an hour. They spoke naturally. They laughed together. They looked for one another before speaking. And, she stopped for a moment. Mrs. Harper, I've seen that look before. Lady Eleanor quietly lowered her eyes. She understood exactly what Mrs. Harper meant. No mother failed to recognize the first signs of love. Lord Ashford stood and walked slowly across the room. His footsteps echoed against the polished wooden floor. For several moments, no one dared to speak. Finally, He stopped before the family portrait hanging above the fireplace. The painting showed generations of the Ashford family. Statesmen, military commanders, judges, scholars. For centuries, the Ashford name had been respected throughout the kingdom. He looked at the portrait before speaking quietly. Lord Ashford, for more than 200 years, our family has carried responsibilities far greater than ourselves. He turned back toward Lady Eleanor. Lord Ashford, Isabella is our only daughter. One day she will inherit our name, our estates, our obligations. He looked directly at Mrs. Harper. A future like that cannot be shared with a man who struggles each day simply to earn his next meal. The words were firm, not cruel, simply shaped by the world in which Lord Ashford had been raised. Lady Eleanor sighed softly. She knew her husband loved Isabella more than anything. Everything he did, he believed was for her future. Still, her mother's heart felt uneasy. Lady Eleanor, perhaps we should speak with Isabella first. She may not realize how serious this situation could become. Lord Ashford remained silent. Then he nodded. Lord Ashford, yes, we will hear the truth from her. But before that, he walked toward his desk. Opening a drawer, he removed a small leather notebook used for estate matters. He closed it again without writing a single word. Instead, he looked toward the window. His voice became quiet, almost thoughtful. Lord Ashford, I want to know everything about Ethan. Where he was born, who raised him, who his friends are, how he earns his living, and whether his intentions toward Isabella are honorable. Mrs. Harper looked surprised. Mrs. Harper, you intend to investigate him? Lord Ashford answered without hesitation. Lord Ashford, as any father would. If this young man has entered my daughter's life, I will know exactly who he is. At that very moment, completely unaware of the conversation taking place inside Ashford Manor, Ethan was closing the doors of his workshop for the evening. He smiled as he noticed a small wildflower lying on his workbench. It had fallen from Isabella's bouquet earlier that afternoon. He carefully picked it up. A quiet smile crossed his face. Ethan, I hope you reached home safely. He placed the flower inside the same wooden box that held the silver rose brooch. Outside, the evening bells echoed across Black Hollow. Ethan had no idea that at the very same moment, the most powerful nobleman in Eldoria had just learned his name. And from that night forward, everything was about to change.